Okay, welcome back. This is part 3 of Unit 7, the lecture on the late Baroque to the Age of Enlightenment. When we last left off, we were talking about David, and I guess the main point I want to make is that we see in him a certain kind of re-adopting of certain kind of trends, certain um, ideas from Poussin, like this interest in art being about serious topics, this interest in a very kind of precise type drawing and painting, really holding to contour lines, having very tight edges, the paint being applied in a very kind of opaque and mostly flat manner. But it's not just a revival of Poussinism, right? There's other different. I think one of the main differences is that David's composition is generally much simpler and really kind of like minimal um, and has this kind of a sense of quiet to it and force. And so that like this his and I would also say that David is just a different mind. Like he was interested in kind of very earnest, very serious topics, and didn't want to kind of like muddy up the issues of readings with various layerings of different characters doing different things. He kept things very clean and precise as to what he was saying. So in the period after, uh, we have kind of like, and actually the period of the combination, right, where we have both Rococo going on into the period where we have the kind of neoclassicism of David and the reaction to the Rococo. There are many artists who were working and they each had to kind of like navigate their own kind of version of a balance between these things and how much they were going to follow any of those trends or make artwork that was more kind of conservative and harkening back to even older times. And I think an artist like Elizabeth Vigge-LeBrun is a good example of one who really kind of successfully navigated these different kind of trends. You can see certain aspects of her painting that are very kind of Rococo like her use of white, in these areas is very similar to Fragonard. Her interest in these kind of really soft, semi-transparent layering of colors, very reminiscent of Fragonard and of Watteau. But she's a little bit tighter and crisper in her drawing, a little bit more similar to someone like David. And I just also want to say that I really admire and I love Lebrun's paintings in general, and I especially really love and admire this self-portrait. It is on many of the tests in this class, and yeah, I talk about it a number of times. So, but also someone like Chardin, who's a great painter that I will not have enough time to cover in great detail, but another artist who's kind of in um, this period where these two main trends are going on, but we can see it also in other artists like Paciello Tarde. Um, I mentioned earlier that I've seen actually this pastel drawing. It is really gorgeous, um, and and once again, remember what we were talking about in terms of genre painting, right? The Chocolate Girl is a pretty good example of that. Of like one of the things about genre work in general was this a growing interest in people who were just a little bit below the class of the wealthy who would be buying the paintings. So that kind of an interest in the servant class. And now let's just talk a little bit about how we see all these same kind of trends play out in England. Remember when we last were talking about England, we were talking about Van Dyck and his influence on England. But it's not until Gainsborough and Sir Joshua Reynolds that we actually see some homegrown painters in England. And they're, um, and I would say with Gainsborough, between the two, he's definitely the more influenced by the Rococo. His painting manner is more transparent, more gesture-based, looser, and also his interest in subject matters is a little bit more kind of on the pleasure side. Um, but the main difference is really more in the paint handling. And Sir Joshua Reynolds is more tied in some ways to the neoclassicists, but um, if because of his interest in kind of tighter, crisper edges and more opaque paint. But I think in some ways we could also see in Sir Joshua Reynolds, we can see kind of like a hint of where English Romanticism is going to go. And so this lecture, as right from the start I said, is up to the Age of Enlightenment. And one of the interesting things about this whole transition of time is that there was no real kind of art movement that represented the Age of Enlightenment. And I think there were certainly some artists, and I think probably Joseph Wright of Derby is probably the best example of someone who kind of represents a Age of Enlightenment aesthetic, right? He literally was making artwork about the scientific revolutions of his age. Um, but um, but I think one of the reasons why we don't have kind of like a definite art movement representing that aesthetic trend is because the Age of Enlightenment was immediately taken over by the Age of Revolutions, and the changes of revolutions and the Industrial Revolution pretty much kind of soured people the on the optimism of the Age of Enlightenment, and I think that really led to why Romanticism was the major next movement and not a more kind of neoclassical version of an interest in the modern world. All right, and I think that's it. All right, that's the end of the lecture. Okay, when I next talk to you, we'll be talking about printmaking. That's right. All right, see you soon.